Hey, what's going on, y'all? Eric Mulder here with Code Red Conversations. Thanks for joining me. In today's video, we're going to be going over the body cam footage and the DA report from the Andrew Brown shooting. The body cam footage was recently released, and there is a ton of information that needs to be addressed so we can understand this entire shooting from a rational and legal perspective. So I'll play a good portion of the DA's testimony or the DA's statement as he clarifies all the details. I'll comment here and there throughout the course of the video. Then we'll get into the primary footage from multiple angles from the various officers who were involved in the shooting. As is almost always the case, you have an initial reaction that goes out when people first hear about a Black man being shot. And there's a narrative that is pushed out by the mainstream media or by the attorneys involved, typically the ambulance chasers involved. And then the reality comes forward, glaringly forward, with the body cam footage. I'm hoping that if you're a new listener, a new watcher, at the very least, you're willing to wait and get all the evidence before coming to a conclusion one way or another. So without further ado, we're going to jump right into the DA speaking.
On Wednesday, April 21st, 2021, Andrew Brown Jr. of Elizabeth City, North Carolina, was shot and killed by 3 deputies with the Pasquotank County Sheriff's Office. This incident occurred at the residence of Mr. Brown, located at 421 Perry Street in Elizabeth City, North Carolina. After reviewing the investigation conducted by the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation, Mr. Brown's death, while tragic, was justified because Mr. Brown's actions caused 3 deputies with the Pasquotank County Sheriff's Office to reasonably believe it was necessary to use deadly force to protect themselves and others. While the officer-involved shooting that resulted in the death of Andrew Brown occurred on Wednesday, April 21st, law enforcement involvement with Mr. Brown began in the weeks prior.
Now, this is a vital part of the entire video. It plays a role in the decisions that the officers took while on scene. You have to understand that if you're an officer and you have particular knowledge of who the suspect is, their criminal past, their criminal history, it will impact your decision. So pay attention, listen clearly as to Andrew Brown's past and his prior record.
And put the wheels in motion that eventually led to the attempted service of arrest and search warrants on April 21, 2021. In the early months of this year, Detective Johnson with the Dare County Sheriff's Office received information from a reliable confidential source that Andrew Brown Jr. from Elizabeth City was selling drugs in Dare County. Detective Johnson contacted Pasquotank County and confirmed Mr. Brown's identity and that he is a known drug dealer. Upon learning this information, Detective Johnson, with the aid of the confidential informant, made 2 undercover buys from Brown on March 17th, 2021 and March 29th, 2021. Those buys were of cocaine and heroin, respectively. A later SBI lab analysis determined that the heroin was laced with fentanyl.
We have a known drug dealer selling cocaine and heroin, and with the heroin laced with fentanyl, which has garnered more attention, in particularly based on the George Floyd case. But it is known to be an extremely dangerous drug. Let's continue.
Subsequently, arrest warrants were issued for Brown's arrest on April 20th, 2021. Simultaneous with the activity of the Dare County Sheriff's Office, Pasquotank County Sheriff's Office began collecting their own intelligence on the drug activity of Mr. Brown at his residence at 421 Perry Street. Detective Ryan Meads applied for and obtained a search warrant for the residence and vehicles of Mr. Brown. On Tuesday, April 20th, 2021, law enforcement now possessed 2 arrest warrants for the sale of controlled substances in Dare County, as well as a search warrant for the residence and vehicles of Mr. Brown. The Pasquotank Special Operation and Tactics Team would serve the warrants and take Mr. Brown into custody.
One additional note, when the definition for probable cause here in Nevada Is probable cause exists when the facts and circumstances known to the officer will warrant a prudent person in believing that a crime had been committed and that the accused had committed it. So if you put in a search warrant, an arrest warrant actually, then the evidence has already been established. And then you are allowed to go and conduct an arrest. So you have a known drug dealer, and confidential informant was able to establish who he was, what he did. He was selling drugs. So as they approached him initially, and we're about to get into that here shortly, as they approached him, they were about to take him based on PC, probable cause. Keep that in mind.
Deputies Morgan, Llewellyn, Bishop, and Swindale were wearing body cameras. Their original plan was to serve the warrants on the night of April 20, 2021. However, Mr. Brown was not at his residence and could not be located by the surveillance team. On the morning of April 21, 2021, at approximately 5:30 a.m., law enforcement held a briefing here at the Pasquotank County Sheriff's Office and planned to serve the warrants on Mr. Brown. During the briefing conducted by Sergeant Meads, the team was briefed on Mr. Brown and his past involvement with law enforcement. It was relayed to the team that
a very important part coming up. Very important part coming up. Pay attention, please.
Mr. Brown has multiple resist arrest charges and convictions dating back to 1995. Additionally, Mr. Brown has assault with a deadly weapon, and assault inflicting serious injury convictions dating back to 95.
Let's play that again. Let's back up a few seconds here and play that again. I want y'all to hear that.
It was relayed to the team that Mr. Brown has multiple resist arrest charges and convictions dating back to 1995. Additionally, Mr. Brown has assault with a deadly weapon, and assault inflicting serious injury convictions dating back to 95.
So basically, he has demonstrated a propensity to be violent, a propensity to resist the police. And they knew that going in. They knew that there was a heightened risk. If he didn't have those charges, that might have impacted the way they responded, maybe. But then again, if you couple his actions in the video during the attempted arrest with his prior criminal record, made for a bad combination.
Brown has barricaded doorways during previous home search warrant instances. No children were believed to be at the location, and the mother of Mr. Brown's minor children was seldom at his residence. At approximately 8 a.m., Mr. Brown was located on Speed Street here in Elizabeth City by one of the members of the Dare County narcotics team. Mr. Brown then drove his vehicle to his residence at 421 Perry Street and remained in his vehicle until law enforcement arrived. Upon receiving this information, the Pasquotank County team traveled to 421 Perry Street to serve the warrants in a clearly marked Pasquotank County Sheriff's Office truck with blue lights and emergency lights flashing.
And why is that important? Because the fact that they were clearly identified as law enforcement, he couldn't have used the excuse, or it would be difficult for him and his attorneys in this case and family, to use the excuse that he didn't know what was going on. When you see a vehicle pull up that clearly has sheriff written down the side, you see officers, or you see people jumping out of vehicles with sheriff written on their gear, their body armor, you know what's going on. And then you already know your own criminal activity. So you're not an innocent victim in this whole situation. You're not.
Detective Langley from Dare County drove the vehicle, and Deputy Lunsford was in the passenger seat. The remaining members of the Pasquotank County team were in the truck bed as the truck was en route. Upon arriving to 421 Perry Street at approximately 8:23 a.m., Mr. Brown was still sitting in his vehicle beside the residence. Detective Langley pulled the Pasquotank County truck in the driveway with his right front bumper close to the front bumper of Brown's vehicle to block any forward motion, and Brown was still seated in the vehicle. The 6 members of the Pasquotank County team approached Brown's vehicle, identified themselves, shouted commands to show them his hands and to exit the vehicle. All members were wearing clearly marked Pasquotank County Sheriff's Office gear and uniforms.
We're going to move into the portion of the video where the DA shows some still photos from the body cams before we get into the primary body cam footage that is coming up, but it's going to demonstrate what took place in order to give you a good understanding of why exactly the officers made the decisions that they made.
Deputy Lunsford headed directly to the driver's door with his weapon drawn and attempted to open the door. Deputy Swindale accompanied Deputy Lunsford to the driver's side of the car. Deputy Llewellyn went around the Pasquotank County truck and approached the vehicle from the front passenger side.
You have about 6 SWAT officers or 6 officers in general arrive at your home. Clearly marked police vehicle, clearly marked police uniforms, tactical gear, giving you verbal commands to comply. Let me see your hands, get out of the vehicle. And then you decide that you want to get away. You're an idiot. And you are putting your life in someone else's hands. I know we live in a time where the idea or the concept of compliance is mocked and vilified, which shows you where we are as a nation. People's lives don't seem to matter as much as they try to cry and plead otherwise. If you really cared about Black lives, or any lives for that matter, you would tell them to comply and do what they're told to do. Not fight, not try to run, not try to flee from the police. You would let that be known, especially when you're out there committing crimes.
Deputy Bishop, Sergeant Meads were directly in front of Brown's vehicle, and Deputy Morgan approached last and positioned himself between Deputy Bishop and Sergeant Meads. Brown was holding his phone when law enforcement approached. He skipped.
I mean, this image alone right here, I don't see how it gets any more clear than that. You see officers standing in front of you with their guns drawn, pointing at you, telling you to comply.
Brown threw the phone down and began to rapidly back his car away from the officers.
One point I want you to remember while you're watching this video is that we have the benefit of still photos, of rewinding the video, watching it again, watching it progress in slow motion. When you're the officer on the scene during a dynamic situation, everything's happening in seconds. You don't have the benefit of hindsight. I've mentioned that before. And thankfully, when it comes to the split-second decisions that officers make, the Supreme Court acknowledges and understands that the cop on the scene, the cop in the fray, in the midst of the situation, does not have those options, does not have that benefit of hindsight. He or she has to make a decision at that moment to potentially save his life or someone else's life. So take that into consideration. You could sit up here, we can rewind it. And after the video, I'm going to put the full link down in the bottom from the whole DA's speech and report. But if you listen further on, and I'm not going to show it here, but the Q&A session after the video was over, you hear a lot of people asking questions. Well, how come the officer didn't do this? How come the officer didn't do that? Which is fine. It's fine to ask those questions, but they have to understand it from the perspective of a reasonable officer with the information that they had at that moment. You cannot properly evaluate a police incident unless you consider that. Anything else is simply your opinion as a unqualified, typically unqualified citizen.
Brown threw the phone down and began to rapidly back his car away from the officers. Deputy Lunsford's hand was still on the driver's door handle as Brown's car reversed and the handle was snatched out of his hand. At this moment, Deputy Lunsford yelled out, and Deputy Lunsford was pulled over the hood of Brown's vehicle where his body and his safety equipment were struck by the vehicle.
Which is already putting them at a potential risk. Already. Because he's using a, 2,000-pound vehicle in his attempt to flee?
Deputy Lunsford's left arm was squarely on the hood. Deputy Lunsford took evasive action to get out of the way of the front left tire of Brown's vehicle, and law enforcement commands became more heated with profanities shouted for Brown to stop the car.
More warnings, more opportunities for him to stop doing what he's doing and comply and surrender.
Once again, I will repeat, you're looking at Deputy Llewellyn's body cam, and he went around the Pasquotank County truck. He approached from the passenger side. Deputy Bishop, Sergeant Meads were directly in front of Brown's vehicle, and Deputy Morgan approached last and positioned himself between Deputy Bishop and Sergeant Meads. Brown was holding his phone when law enforcement approached. Brown ignored the officer's commands and backed his car until he was blocked by the rear of his residence. Brown then put the car in drive and turned the steering wheel left, directly at law enforcement officers who had now surrounded his vehicle. Despite this tense situation and the aggressive driving by Mr. Brown, no law enforcement officer fired a shot.
So they hadn't fired a shot yet, but he backed up, demonstrating his clear intentions to get away. And just look right here. Look at the video. Look at the still picture here. In order for him to get away, he had technically at least three officers that we can see on screen that were in front of him. They were in front of his vehicle. In order for him to get away, he had to drive towards them. They are completely unaware as to what his exact intentions were. Was he just trying to get away? Probably. But could he have been attempting to run them over in the process? That's very possible. No one will know ultimately. But once again, his decision to flee put him in the situation where he ended up getting shot.
As Brown's car starts forward, Deputy Lunsford was now positioned directly in front of the vehicle, and all officers were shouting commands to stop.
Yep.
Brown ignored the commands and drove directly at Deputy Lunsford. Deputy Lunsford used his left hand to push off of the hood. It was at this moment that the first shot is fired. Deputy Lunsford then spun out of the way to avoid being run over by Brown's vehicle.
So Brown's driving put him in contact with the officer. He drove into the officer.
According to the North Carolina Justice Academy forensic analyst Cason Reynolds, the first shot was fired by Sergeant Meads, and it entered the front windshield of Mr. Brown's car. Let me say that again. It entered the front windshield of Mr. Brown's car.
An important point, because when you heard Benjamin Crump and his team of attorneys, they claimed that it was an execution. To me, an execution would have been that they walked up to his vehicle prior to giving any verbal commands whatsoever and just gunned him down. But as we can see with the still photos, nothing like that even took place. We're going to jump right into the body cam footage now.
Show you the 4 body cam videos that depict law enforcement activity with Mr. Brown on that day.
first body cam. Here's the second one. Pretty clear he drove at him, and those officers had to make a decision. Now, people often ask, how come the officers ask to see the suspect's hands after they've shot at him? Well, he was only shot 3 times, if I'm not mistaken. So, and there were 14 shots fired in total. The vast majority of them hitting a moving vehicle. So you're not going to be 100% accurate. So you don't know if he's alive or not. So you have to give those commands that if he's alive and he's coherent, for him to comply, put his hands up to minimize any further risks. So that's why they do it. And another thing, I heard someone else commented on my first video when I discussed this issue, wondering why the police officers drove up on him so quickly. That's because you want the element of surprise. It's a tactical approach, common sense, nothing diabolical about it. It's just the information was that he was in his vehicle. They wanted to have the element of surprise to approach him and get him to surrender so that they can take him into custody. And as soon as they saw his condition, they asked for EMS. They got on the radios and called for medical help. Again, another call for EMS. Last video. Now, another question that some people may have is why would they shoot him while he's driving away? He already has a criminal history of assault, of resisting with a deadly weapon. Who knows the extent that he may seek to get away? Would he be willing to potentially put someone else's life at risk in order to get away? That's possible. But once again, these officers have to make these decisions in a fraction of a second, split seconds.
The fourth civilian to give a statement was Amber Santiago. Ms. Santiago stated she was in a relationship with Mr. Brown and stated they had a telephone conversation the night before where Brown stated he believed the police were following him. Ms. Santiago further stated that Mr. Brown said he was going to stay at a hotel rather than staying at his residence at 421 Perry Street.
Now, that's pretty interesting. That could dictate as to why he might have fled, because he was already under the suspicion that cops were after him.
On April 21, 2021, Mr. Brown's body was transported to the medical examiner's office in Greenville, North Carolina, where an autopsy was performed.
Very important.
The autopsy was conducted by Dr. Karen L. Kelly, a forensic pathologist of the medical examiner's office at the Brody School of Medicine in Greenville. That was done on Thursday, April 22nd, 2021. I had telephone contact with Dr. Kelly on May 12th, at which time we discussed her findings. Dr. Kelly determined Brown suffered 2 gunshot wounds, one to the right shoulder, upper arm that was non-lethal, and a second wound to the back of the head at the base of the skull near the hairline. There were 3 bullet fragments recovered from the wound to the back of the head.
3 fragments.
Dr. Kelly found multiple abrasions on Brown's right arm, right leg, and on his back. Dr. Kelly advised me that these injuries were superficial and appeared to be made by shrapnel. Additionally, Dr. Kelly recovered a plastic baggie containing an off-white, rock-like substance from inside of Mr. Brown's mouth. The substance is consistent with crystal meth and was the size of a 50-cent piece and too large to swallow. Dr. Kelly determined the cause of death to be multiple gunshot wounds.
So dude had drugs on him, put it in his mouth, hoping no one would see it, and he was trying to get away. But there you have it. You have a pretty decent breakdown of all the details. I wanted to make a shorter video, but I really wanted you to have all the information, or a good portion of the information. Once again, I attached the link below. So if you want to watch the full almost an hour and a half video, just so you can be aware of what exactly went down, feel free to do so. And then you'll be a little more knowledgeable, because most people will hear a few news clips and then they'll determine whether they believe it or not. Now, considering everything that went down and how quickly it all went down, I completely believe that the officers were justified in shooting Brown. And I'll say this again, as I said earlier in the video, compliance saves lives. Now, it's not going to happen in every single situation. It should, but you have to take into consideration human error, bad cops, poor training. But in over 99% of the cases, complying will save your life. It's plain and simple. His family's suffering now because of his choices. His choices to be a drug dealer, knowing that it's a crime, drugs that could put other people's lives at risk. He chose to sell them when it was against the law. He chose to flee when the officers attempted to make an arrest. His choices, y'all. Well, what do y'all think? I'd love to know what your thoughts are. Do you think the officers were in the right? Do you think they should have let him go and maybe tried to arrest him another day? But you also have to consider his prior record, because what happens if he's driving down the street in his attempt to get away and he runs over someone else? Who would be responsible for that ultimately? So comment down below. I'm going to post another link to a video that I think will be very helpful to you as well. In the meantime, stay safe, God bless, and make sure you join the conversation.